Today we're reviewing and discussing General Spalding's book called Stealth War. His name is Brigadier General Robert S. Spalding III. And just to give you a little bit background on him so that you know that he's very qualified for this book. It's on China, called Stealth War, is that first of all, he served as the chief China strategist for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He has also served as a defense official and defense attaché in China, in Beijing. So he speaks Mandarin. And he served the White House as a senior director of strategic planning in the National Security Council in D.C. So General Spalding is quite qualified to write this book, and it's very well written, fast-paced for the kind of material that it is, and I recommend the audiobook. The narrator is excellent and moves you along in that very well, too. Now, I want to start with a quote by General Spalding, and it is in regard to the importance and immediacy of the issues that we have with China. If his forecasts remain true when he wrote this book, published it in 2019, then we really have 2 years to do what he's talking about here in dealing with China, and the U.S. does, and for the sake of liberty throughout the world. Here's a quote from the book. The fact is, and this is in 2019, we have about 3 years to stop the CCP's unrestricted war. If we don't, the ideals of liberty that have shaped America, our defining concepts of freedom and independence, will face almost certain destruction at the hands of a totalitarian government that values nothing more than its own power. And he adds, that power is targeting our country in ways that affects everyone at every level. Now, I don't know if he would say things have progressed more quickly in the last year with China's influence than he had anticipated. So maybe his warnings might even be less than 2 years. To figure that out, don't know. So let's start with the book in general, and he's going to go over a number of things in this book. He's going to talk about the fact that, for instance, China is its greatest threat. And when I say China, he says that he loves the Chinese people. He obviously spent time in China, loves the Chinese people. He's talking about the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, not the Chinese people as a whole. And he says that the U.S. Constitution is the greatest threat to the CCP. And freedom of speech and freedom of the press, freedom of religion are the greatest threat to the CCP. Now, he points out at least 6 things. He deals with at least six things in this book that are significant. First is the economy. Secondly, military. These are all China's economy, military, global diplomacy, technology, education, and infrastructure. When I say that, and how the CCP has affected our economy, military, global diplomacy, technology, education, and infrastructure. Now, first of all, he deals with the economy and points out that China is influencing politicians and corporations, and if successful, we will lose our rights, freedom of thought, and speech. And I want to, because it's been election season, I thought I'd start by mentioning the fact that he notes that China's influence has even influenced those that have key positions in the United States political system. Mentions 2 particularly, so that he's on both sides of the aisle with this. First of all, Mitch McConnell, who basically, his sister-in-law deals, so let's put it this way. Spalding points out the fact that, look, if I was in the military and I had somebody in my family or direct family ties that was associated with another country, and especially in positions of leadership, then this would be a compromised position. And therefore, I should not be in that kind of position of leadership. But it seems to be allowed in government, which, reading between the lines, he doesn't think is the wisest thing. So he talks about Mitch McConnell and his family ties with the CCP. First of all, his sister-in-law, she meets with corporate leaders in China and sits on a board of the National Bank. Then Mitch McConnell's own wife, Elaine Chao, she was the Secretary of Labor under George W. Bush's administration. And Elaine Chao, is a family friend of the President of China. And now Elaine Chao oversees U.S. transportation. So there are some connections with Mitch McConnell, and many of you will be familiar with the connections with Mr. Biden. And yet it's interesting to see that when he wrote this book in 2019, he's pointing these things out long before many of the things that have come to attention in the news recently. And first of all, he points out Hunter Biden. Okay, so Hunter Biden teamed up with the Bank of China to create $1 billion investment fund called the Bohai Harvest. And in early December of 2013, Hunter Biden flew with his father on Air Force Two. That would be the jet for, of course, the vice president. And 10 days after this trip, with his father on Air Force Two to China, there was a deal made for $1 billion in funds that had been financed to Bohai Harvest, or at least I believe it's Bohai Harvest, if not another institution related to Hunter Biden. And so it seems that Joe Biden had no issues with this. In fact, it is very clear that this goes way back, as many of you know, to Biden's earlier career, back in 2001 when he pushed for permanent trade with China. And then basically Spalding quotes something that I'm sure many of you have also heard, a direct quote from Joe Biden on the campaign trail, where he says, "China's going to eat our lunch? Come on, man," he said. "They can't even figure out how to deal with the fact that they have this great division between the China Sea and the mountains in the west. They can't figure out how they're going to deal with the corruption that exists within the system. They're not bad folks. But guess what? They're not competition for us." So you see Joe Biden's opinion. Now, the heads, he points, now we go beyond Biden to the fact that Spalding points out that in the economic sphere, China has quite a bit of influence in the United States, including with the heads of some major investment houses and hedge funds here as well. In technology, he points out a certain key technology in China that is an investment here in the United States. Now, you might ask, as we're going through this, what are some of the economic impacts within the United States? it has often been thought that free trade was a good thing. In fact, I was persuaded of this myself, and you can read Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, where he talks about the fact that free trade exists, and when it does exist, nations flourish. And they flourish because one country develops a specialty, and he's thinking, I think, primarily about manufacturing at this point, but other things as well that exist in the economy, producing certain foodstuffs and goods. That one country is especially good at this, and therefore it doesn't matter that they don't produce some of their own stuff that's essential for their livelihood, although I don't know if that he puts it quite that way, but implicitly they can get a lot of what they need from foreign countries who then specialize in something else. And hypothetically, this makes a lot of sense. But I will tell you, and he doesn't mention this here in the book, but Alexander Hamilton, at the time of the writing the United States, time of the U.S. Constitution, and when he was first in office under George Washington, he said that, that is, he held a position in Washington's cabinet. He said that though Smith was probably generally correct most of the time, there are extenuating circumstances in which he is not correct. And that one of those was the situation the United States found itself in, where England's manufacturing was much more advanced, was more advanced than the United States at that point, early part of the Industrial Revolution. And so he thought that it was appropriate for the United States to have tariffs to up the cost of goods from England, which would then encourage manufacturing in the United States. And I think we're going to find that General Spalding takes a similar approach, saying that, look, free trade is not always the optimal thing. And as many of you will know, free trade has been very much a part of the United States and its economy for many years, and was one of the big pluses or pushes for trade with China. So it doesn't matter if you had Democratic or Republicans in the House, in the White House, they were engaging in trade with China. Of course, the two prior Republican presidents before Trump were both in the Bush family, and they were supportive of this. So we're going to see what Spalding is going to point out is a lot of the repercussions of this policy for the United States and how this has affected jobs throughout the United States, especially in the manufacturing industry, especially in lower income families. And I guess I will note on the side, look, if ideally with this idea of free trade in the U.S., if everyone was to want to become computer programmers or something like that, and somehow we could rely completely on the goodwill of our neighbors, and that they were engaged in genuine free trade, which he's going to show the CCP is not, then maybe there would be value in continuing with free trade. However, not everybody in our economy wants to be sitting in front of a computer. A lot of people like to get out and work with their body and do things and do other kinds of creative things and active things. And that's where we have cut off jobs for a lot of people like that. And therefore, there's become a greater gap between the rich and the poor in this country. And largely, he's going to put it on the shoulders of this trade policy with China. Now, first of all, to quote him on some of the issues that we find occurring since the trade with China. By the way, China became a member of the World Trade Organization in 2001, and so a lot of these things have happened since 2001. All right, 3.4 million U.S. jobs vanished between 2001 and 2017 due to relationship with China, due to our trade relationship with China. And that's a huge number of U.S. jobs lost, 3.4 million. And this is according to the China toll deepens. Okay, a study called the China toll deepens, a 2018 study by the Economic Policy Institute, EPI. So there you go. 3.4 million jobs lost since China entered the World Trade Organization. And America's growing trade deficit has swelled since then, and its impact has been catastrophic, according to the EPI. Another statistic, 75% of jobs were lost. Okay, 2.5 million. All right, 75% of jobs lost in manufacturing. So even considering the number of gains also in manufacturing at that time, that's huge, huge. Another statistic, according to the Informative Technology and Innovation Foundation, or Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, in the 2000s, the decline in manufacturing jobs was 5.7 million, or 33% of total manufacturing jobs. Okay, I must have had the statistics incorrect because I put 75% of jobs lost. But maybe that's just 75% of total jobs lost. We'll take that as my opinion of what he wrote. So that may be or my written notes of what he wrote. But he has 75% of certain jobs lost. And but then it was even considering the jobs made up in manufacturing. So it may be a total percentage of 75% of jobs lost that had to do with China trade, or I just may have that figure wrong. Okay, so, but this is still a staggering number, okay? In the 2000s, the decline in manufacturing jobs is 5.7 million, which is 33% of the total manufacturing jobs. That exceeds the Great Depression of 30.9%. That's huge loss, and that's just in the 2000s. Now, the trade deficit with China from 2001 to 2011 reduced the incomes of affected workers by $3.7 billion a year. $3.7 billion a year. So, the United States economy and the amount of jobs for manufacturing has seriously decreased with the trade that we've had with China as the CCP. That's the important issue here, because the CCP does not operate as a real free market economy. Primarily, it doesn't put its own money on the foreign exchange, and for the most part, with some exceptions, all the money that goes into China stays in China. So those are some big reasons. And also, in addition to that, he points out the fact that the CCP government heavily during that time has heavily subsidized steel, glass, paper, concrete, and state-owned industries to export products to the United States. They have subsidies, all these things, to export to the U.S. So the government is having a huge role in the economy. This is not the kind of free trade with a free market economy. He calls this an intentional war with the U.S. Now, this also involves the fact that including the U.S. intellectual property, China has they steal United States intellectual property. China does or allows it, and they actually steal it. The CCP does. China has also a closed economy, and as I mentioned before, they manipulate. There's a manipulation of its own currency. All of this points to unrestricted warfare. And by the way, he points to a book by that effect by two generals from China in the 1990s. And so that's a book to look at to see if General Spalding is correct about that strategy. And I hope to do a book review on that as well. Now, once again, in the middle of this, it's worth emphasizing that General Spalding loves the Chinese people. He's simply talking about the CCP. Okay? And by implication, the CCP has been oppressive toward its own people in many ways. So, coming back to this free trade argument, we talked about free trade. The free trade argument always advances the prosperity of a nation as a whole, though not every individual becomes prosperous as a whole. So it allows countries to focus on their strengths, as we talked about before. So it allows countries to focus on their strengths, supposedly, and there is the acknowledgement that not everyone does perfectly well there. There is in economics on the side, I'll say, something called creative destruction. This happened to the spinsters. These are women who spun cloth, did the spinning to produce clothing and so forth, just prior to the Industrial Revolution. But once that was carried on by machines and manufacturing, they lost their work. Well, there was an advance there, but they lost their work and they were going to have to re-educate themselves. And often that's an argument from free trade. That you see, you have this creative destruction and people have to re-educate themselves. And we're hearing some words of that now. I mean, our economy is being destroyed by the coronavirus and people have to re-educate themselves for a different career and so forth. However, there's a lot of things that come into play here, and that is that creative destruction can work effectively when there's genuine free market economy and it's in trade with other free market economies. And if there are people in your own country that do want to work in a certain type of work, okay, let's say labor work, as opposed to intellectual work, you're sitting at your desk, that's purely intellectual like that. I say purely intellectual, you know what I'm saying by comparison, then there should still be jobs for those people who want to do that kind of hard labor, because there will be resources within a country that can be tapped into and be used, whether it be mining or manufacturing for local consumption. All kinds of things can be done. But here we have a situation where China is heavily subsidizing all these products to make it so U.S. companies almost can't compete with the price, and people are willing to buy their goods, okay, because they're so much cheaper. Although in certain cases, my comment on the side, you actually pay more in the long run for certain Chinese products because they break down so frequently. The difference between nail clippers, okay, you get those from China or someplace like that. But if you're talking about something like an auto part and you've got to put it in your car, just think about the reliability of that product. If it's not as reliable and it breaks down a number of times, you not only have to replace the product several times, but you also have to have the labor that's paid for to replace that part. So actually, even though it seems cheaper, it ends up being more expensive in the long run. But the CCP subsidizes these things in order to engage with this unrestricted war with the United States in an economic sense. Now, but anyways, free trade has this argument that it's supposed to be beneficial to all the countries with the exception of a few people within them. But he points out that in 1990 to 2007 shows that this is not always true. And it's certainly not been true of the Rust Belt in the United States. U.S. Census Bureau of 2000-2010 makes income and property data, deals with that in the distribution of household wealth report. Points out that the chasm between America's rich and poor populations is expanding at a stunning rate in terms of household wealth. All assets a household owns minus the debt it owes, okay? So it's this idea of the difference between the rich and the poor is expanding at this stunning rate. And a lot of this, he suggests, falls on the shoulders of this trade relationship that we have with China. And so really, if the United States wants to increase jobs, then it should be putting a lid on this kind of relationship with China. And those who don't want to put a lid on it, those who want to let it just keep going as is, or even increase it, they're actually going to bring about the destruction of more jobs in the future. The median income of households in the bottom, 20% decreased by $5,124 over the 2000 to the 2010 period. The median income of the households in the top 20% increased by $61,379 from 2000 to 2010. Now, when we're given these figures, a lot of times people say, well, you see, I mean, it has to do with the taxes and the relationship of taxation to the rich and all the benefits they get from taxation. This is not what he's suggesting. He's suggesting that a lot of this has to do with this trade relationship with the CCP, and that in reality, what it's doing is it's cutting away at the kind of jobs that people made good income in, and putting them now at a lower level of income. For instance, manufacturing job in this country would pay a decent living wage, all right? But what if your manufacturing jobs are cut down the board? And now a lot of those people, instead of going to work at a manufacturing for a manufacturing company, what are they doing? They might be trying to find work at Walmart, or and I'm not just picking on Walmart, but going to work at a lower paying wage, in a service industry of some kind. And so this is the problem. So that's one reason a lot of these people are making less income. And as many of you know, you have to engage in more than one of these jobs often just to stay afloat, and maybe more than one of these jobs for each person in a couple. So a lot of this he's saying is because we've lost these kinds of jobs which pay a better wage for people. And they used to have at least more benefits as well. So, and the CCP created an extremely, here's what the CCP did to ensure this kind of, kind of strong economy for themselves. The CCP has got its hands in a lot of business, and whenever it wants to, it's going to tighten down the screws. But in other respects, it said, well, let's just loosen up as much as possible wherever we can. And so it deregulates, and in an extremely laissez-faire fashion, extremely do-whatever-you-want attitude with business. In other words, this is beyond it's almost beyond the classical laissez-faire type of business attitude, which was the foundation of classical liberalism. and the economy in the United States, where there's still certain restrictions on contracts and theft of property. And some of those, of course, are expanded later to include breaking up of monopolies and copyright laws and so forth. Well, the CCP says to business owners, for the most part, go just do whatever you want. I mean, you can steal copyrighted material, you can tread on other businesses in ways that would not have been acceptable in this country even 200 years ago, for sure. Now, there are no environmental regulations as well, and no penalties for copyright infringements, I pointed out. Every Chinese company must have a Chinese committee member on the property. Okay, so there's got to be a CCP, essentially a CCP committee member, well, I should say, on the board of the financial institutes. But I think what we're talking about here is he's talking about every Chinese company has to have a Chinese committee member on the property. And this would be true of Chinese businesses wherever they conduct business. So Chinese businesses are dog eat dog, except when the CCP wants it otherwise, and when they want to control things. And by the way, I mentioned there's no environmental regulations. Later on in the book, he will point out this fact within China, that China is a gross polluter, as we all know. And sometimes it's thought, well, we just need to, crack down on the U.S. even more, and then we'll have good moral standing to crack down on China as well. However, what China does is it gets around these things. As he's pointed out, China has set up coal plants in the Soviet Union and perhaps some other neighboring countries, but certainly in the Soviet Union, which is his neighbor, and then that power is pumped back into China. So they get around, saying they say they pollute less as a result of this, but really it's they are doing the polluting. So you could try to squeeze the screws tighter. You might squeeze a little out, but they're gonna find a way to take the blame off themselves for pollution, at least in this case of these power plants. So, a strict trade policy with China is really in the best interests of those who are concerned about the environment. Of course, all of us are concerned about the environment to some extent, but it's unfortunate that many who speak loudly about the environmental causes focus simply on the United States. They may certainly want to engage in agreements in terms of protocols with other nations, and yet don't realize that in practice, I would say, that electing officials that are closely tied to the CCP is actually going to cause more environmental problems than they realize. Now, foreign businesses, so we're going again with businesses here, foreign companies can do business in China if they have a Chinese business partner. Okay, here we go. With a CCP committee member to monitor the business. So you got to be, if you're a foreign company and you do business with China, then if you're a Chinese business partner, you have to have a Chinese committee member or committee to monitor your business. That tells you how much China has influence with these companies who are doing business over there, or at least has. Some recent things have happened with the present administration of the United States, with Trump administration, which may have changed some of these things, but this has been the case. I'm not up to date on all the things, the effects that this has had recently. So Chinese have closed their economy, and all money coming into China, as I pointed out before, stays in China. This, of course, there's a few exceptions to this with pressure related to the CCP and what their goals are. So China, as he points out, is not a free market society. Thus, the argument that free markets balance themselves out is ridiculous. Now, compare China and its payment of business things and dealings with the United States and its history. Well, the U.S. did subsidize railroads, so that was a business. Of course, we know they pay for public highways and so forth, but, or at least the states do. So government officials do. But here, the U.S. government was involved with the railroads, and that was a particular industry, you see, a specific industry, and that is true. But the CCP goes well beyond that, because beyond, say, railroads, most businesses are paid for in the U.S. with business investment, and government basically serves businesses. Now, we know that some of these things there have been big boons of money going into business with the initiation of the coronavirus, and that has been since the time this book is written. Much of that would not fit within free market economic principles. But here, he is pointing out that traditionally the U.S. has laid back from investing in other businesses. The Chinese government, to the contrary, the government subsidizes numerous industries, and these industries exist for the sake of the government. So a big difference there. Now, he points out the fact that China's economy has had an incredible expansion in this period of time since 2001. Its growth has been absolutely phenomenal. It's probably more phenomenal than any nation perhaps in history. Going from a country of relative poverty and farmers to a country that is probably the top manufacturing country in the world. Now, he asks, how has it been able to take so many people out of poverty so quickly? And here's a quote, a one-sentence summary from General Spalding. They did it by issuing and obtaining massive amounts of credit, by generating billions in foreign investment that remains unrecuperable, and by creating a walled, closed economic system that remains unaccountable to foreign audits and fleeces foreign investors. It fleeces foreign investors. One of his biggest examples of the fleecing of foreign investors are the ghost cities in China. These are cities that have been built in China, largely with investment from Western bankers. These cities have been built in China. They're mostly vacant. Though there may be some people there, they're mostly vacant at this point. And they have high-rise apartments with no one in them. There are 64 million empty apartments total. Now, how in the world, if this is the case, they're off the market. These apartments are off the market. If that were for the long period of time, how that could not happen in the United States or other major countries in the world, because those apartments would go down in value. It'd be an issue of supply and demand. Well, there's that many vacant apartments. There's a huge supply compared to the demand, and so then you would have to sell them or rent them out in a certain period of time for the investors to be able to pay the money they owe to the bank, so that the bank wouldn't default on them, right? And so if there's a huge supply now and little demand now, you got to take care of that pretty quickly. And a lot of times what happens is, therefore, the price, you got to lower the price of those apartments, the monthly price, or the overall price of a condominium, when it has to go down and down in value until enough people can afford to pay for them, and that amount that you're getting from those people adds up to enough that's going to pay your banker, so they won't default on you. However, China doesn't deal this way with banking fairly, okay? It has all these Western bankers that have invested this money in these ghost cities. However, China isn't paying them. China is holding them off. And so within its own system, it just simply says to the borrower, oh, okay, you owe, let's pretend you owed $100,000 in a particular little spot for its construction. Well, you can't pay, for your investment, for the investment made in this right away. Okay, well, a month goes by, and let's just say the interest is $1,000. All right, make it simple. The interest is $1,000 for that month. So all we're going to do, instead of normally a person would be, oh, you're a month behind, so you owe $1,000. And then the next month you're another month behind, so you're $2,000 behind. And you eventually better pay this up. And fairly quickly, within a certain framework of time. But that's not the way China goes about this. What they do is they say, look, you owe $100,000 in this. Okay, next month you got $1,000 you should be paying. But if you can't pay that, now we just simply make your loan equal to $101,000. Your overall loan that you have to pay in the long run. Okay, the next month you can't pay, that's another $1,000. We'll add it, and now you have $102,000 you owe. And then $103,000 the next month, you can't pay it. So it just keeps extenuating this and extenuating this. And the idea essentially is that you're keeping it off the market, and you can still say it's valued at this high amount because you don't have to sell because you're not paying your creditor. So that's how they keep the cost high, artificially high. Well, then what's going to happen? Seems like one of the things is General Spalding, what's the game plan here in a sense? And he's talked to, he mentions a gentleman who had interviewed with a banker and said to this banker, what is your greatest fear at night? I'm just curious, in your business, what's your greatest fear at night? And he says, China, that one day they're going to default on all the loans they owe to our bank, to the Western banking system. And we're concerned about the loans they owe us, that they're really going to pay. And what might happen is they could at some point default and pay $20 for every 100, 20% of the dollar, you see. And then what would happen? Well, bang, this would put a huge crunch on the Western banking system. It might even bring it to its knees. And then at that point, China says, well, now they can reevaluate the price of these apartments. That's a lot less than before now that we've defaulted on these loans. And then they'll put it at a price where numerous Chinese people can actually afford the apartment. Now, once these people are now living in apartments, what do these people need? They need refrigerators, they need dishwashers, television sets, whatever. And hey, that's the kind of thing that China produces. It manufactures those kinds of goods. So now these Chinese manufacturing firms have a bigger market in their own people, less reliance on shipping these goods abroad. So this is a part of the supposed game plan here with how China could deal with this situation of these ghost cities. And these ghost cities are very sophisticated. He says you'd be amazed at some of these ghost cities. And it was either he or someone else who was actually taken on a tour, General Spalding or someone else that was taken on a tour of these ghost cities and pointed out how many amenities they have. I mean, the public works they have in these places are phenomenal. He mentioned a particular one that had an artificial lake that is surrounded by huge granite seating area, and which is spectacular. And then all kinds of other amenities that any modern city would have. And the person that was bringing them on the tour, I believe it was, said to them, "This is our Silicon Valley." In other words, this is what they hope to do in the future: make their own Silicon Valley, and this would be where people would live for their Silicon Valley. So this is their future plan for this at least one, if not more, ghost cities. So you can see how this feeds into their desire to be a self-service, self-sufficient economy. They're modeling their model kind of the way the United States was in the 1950s, where we produced many of the goods that we consumed, and we were self-sustaining as a whole. So there's a lot of issues surrounding the CCP and how they are using a situation where they will say, "Oh yes, free trade," and put forward the surface show that they want to have free trade and engage with trade with other nations. But really what that means is free trade on our terms. Okay. And I think that you can see that General Spalding has tried to argue that with numerous points that I've mentioned to you so far. Now, as I say, there are numerous things that he deals with in this book, and I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm really going to encourage you to read or listen to the book. Very, very good audiobook, if that's what you have time for. But I have mentioned to you a number of the things that he goes through, and I will come back and remind you that he deals with the economy, he deals with the military, global diplomacy, technology, education, and the infrastructure. I'll mention a few other things in that respect too. Maybe it'll whet your appetite to read more in the book. For instance, in the military, he points out the fact that even, I believe it's the stealth bomber, if I'm not mistaken, that the United States holds, and it's one of its greatest tools. And he points out that the stealth bomber is so susceptible to the Chinese infiltration of our technology that we don't even know if they might have a back door in a stealth bomber to actually control it and take the controls away from us. It can be that serious. In terms of technology, I've mentioned a few of the things that he's mentioned as far as stealing technology from our country and using it against us. One of these things, of course, has to do with information technology, though he might deal with that under the infrastructure issues. And I'll deal with that under the infrastructure issues in a moment. But certainly the pirating of technology and using it against us. I should also point out to you in the economy how the CCP uses numerous things against us as well that I haven't mentioned. This is in one of the categories. It may not be under economy that he mentions this, but these trade issues with China. It used to be that the United States had a rule where they could actually ship things from China from foreign countries to the U.S. Postal Service would absorb a huge amount of the cost of this, to a great detriment to it, basically putting it in the hole quite a bit. And this was to encourage early on, to encourage further, economies to third world economies, especially to grow and to flourish. But this has been used especially by lots of shipments from China, so that you could purchase something, let's say on Amazon or some other place, that the cost of the shipping from China to you is actually cheaper than it would be if it was, a couple states away from you within the United States. And so this gives another financial advantage, in a sense, to these Chinese companies. Another hook there to entice people to buy from China. And even this does happen, he points out, in certain instances where, because they're stealing our information, they're also stealing our copyrights. They're stealing from manufacturers in our country, and they're, as many of you know, they're making copies of some of our manufactured goods that look exactly like our products, with the same name brand. Everything looks exactly the same, but really it's a Chinese knockoff. And so you purchase it, it's sent to you through a company. He mentions Amazon Marketplace in this particular case, that it comes to people and they don't know it's from China, and it ends up being a Chinese knockoff rather than the product that they wanted to purchase. So this, I bring that up partially because I mentioned to you the technology and the fact that they will copy technology, but they are also stealing, people are stealing all kinds of products from the United States and duplicating them without real ramifications from the CCP. Okay, education. He points out a number of things here. We know about many of the Chinese students here in this country, and he points out that the restrictions for people who enter into the U.S., or let's put it this way, the way to monitor or evaluate those Chinese students coming into the United States is so quick that it almost amounts to nothing. He's all for Chinese students who come here and they're genuinely seeking a better life. And if you're a Chinese student here and you're doing that, great, fantastic. We welcome you with open arms in the United States. And that would be General Spalding's perspective. But says there are too many people. Unfortunately, there's enough, at least from the Chinese population, that are coming in that have ties to Chinese, large Chinese companies or influences within China. And they're actually here partially to steal information from the United States as students. And even in some cases, when they are initially coming here for that plan, the Chinese Communist Party will put put pressure on them to actually engage in those things. So, of course, we're all familiar with the Confucius institutes on campuses, and these are places where it may be some good education in Chinese language and culture, but they can also be used as a means, and have been in numerous cases at least, to influence Chinese students to do the CCP's bidding. And he mentioned a professor at one university who saw an official from China on campus. He said, "What are you doing here?" And basically he was just going to monitor something or whatever he said. And so he followed this guy, and he basically went to one of these student meetings, and he was saying, you know that you're beholden to us, that kind of thing. And this gets reinforced by the fact that China has these China credit scores, and those scores are given to people who are Chinese citizens, and if they don't behave properly, there could be ramifications for themselves or for their family members back home as well. So and this happens even in China, where people who don't have a high credit score, some of them are denied the ability to fly places, and some have even had their dogs taken from them. So this is pretty serious. Sometimes there are times when these students are even encouraged to do things here in the United States to suppress voices that would speak up against the Chinese Communist Party. And there was an instance that he brings about by those who were, Tibetan Buddhists who were wanting to have their voice known, and part of that was sequestered. I don't want to confuse the facts that he has from the books here, so let me make that a separate issue and point out that something I haven't brought up, which is very important here in this book, before we get to infrastructure and 5G issues, is the fact that the Chinese Communist Party does persecute Tibetan Buddhists, the Muslim Uyghur population, as well as Christians. And they seek to send them to re-education camps in many cases, but they also have a device for those that they want to put, button down especially, a device that they can put them on, and they do donor harvesting from them. This device keeps them alive in a technical sense, but it's miserable, he says, to be on it, completely miserable. And what happens is one of your organs is taken and given to an organ, you're considered an organ donor for someone who wants to come to China and have, a transplant. And then they keep you alive, and then another organ is taken, and then that's used for a transplant, to the point where basically enough of you is used up where you're basically worthless, and then you're disconnected from the machine and basically thrown out. So this is another form of, horrible persecution that is taking place in China. And so it would seem that those who are really concerned about civil rights, and many who are concerned about civil rights in this country, would see that and say, we've got to be concerned about civil rights in other countries as well. So dealing with the Chinese Communist Party, supporting people in our political system who are sympathetic to the Chinese Communist Party, that is actually violating the civil rights of people in other countries. And if that's going to happen in China, and China to some degree becomes a model for this country as it becomes more and more powerful in the world, then you're going to find that the civil rights of many people in our own nation eventually could be taken, and the same kinds of things could happen to them as well. So this is something for serious consideration. Now, finally, we'll deal with the infrastructure, a few of the infrastructure issues that he deals with. One has to do, of course, with 5G. And the reason that 5G is so significant is because it's such a huge advance in speed and efficiency and all the things that it can do compared to 4G. He doesn't mention the dangers of the radiation associated with it that I can recall. You can read a book called Overpowered by Dr. Blank if you want to look into those issues. Very good book by Columbia University professor. And but here with 5G, he mentions the fact that it's lots of information, okay? And this has to do, of course, with information technology. And so let's start a little bit to begin with there. He points out the importance, as many of us know, of the significance, I should say, of the fact that China has its hands in getting as much information about all of us as they possibly can get. Just as larger tech corporations gather as much data on us as possible. So in that way, China also has its thumbs in that, has its hands in that, and seeks to take as much information as it possibly can, certainly about its own citizens, but also about people throughout the world. And it uses this information to its advantage, and it uses it in unrestricted warfare. So what about 5G? Well, 5G is being used in China for this social credit scores that we've talked about. And that's used because the 5G technology can be used for face recognition software and targeting where people are, what their movements are, and what they're doing. And then they can be docked yay or nay on this social credit score based upon whether they're doing what the CCP wants them to do. And the concern was that the United States have a secure 5G network of its own, because he said this is very important to the United States. And in fact, there have been some moves. He himself, as he pushed this issue in the Joint Chiefs, as his job in the Joint Chiefs, or I should say maybe it was in his later job at the White House, that he pushed these issues and pushed them to a point where actually he found that there were lots of companies that have their ties with the CCP, lots of American companies, lots of people who said, yeah, we know what you're talking about, but we can't deal with that. Basically, they had lots of business ties with China that might mess up our business ties. So he pointed out how much this has influenced the United States, how China has gotten its inroads into the U.S. And that has to do also with 5G technology as the potential there. But he did say one thing, and he was asked to leave, as some people were not happy with what he was doing. He was asked to leave from his job that had a connection with the White House, but at least he was happy that he got one of his proposals put through in, I believe it could be the 2018 proposal, a proposal by the U.S. government, by the President's office, that we have our own secure 5G network. And where that has gone, I don't know. So, but the 5G is a huge concern, and so that's a part of the infrastructure that the Chinese Communist Party certainly is enforcing with its own within its own borders, and would like to do as much as possible in other countries. But it's not the only thing. And the last point I want to point out is the Belt and Road Initiative, which is where China is seeking to build roads in other countries and building manufacturing bases in other countries where people can work and actually build things for ultimately trade with China. And of course, this is prominent in Africa mostly, but they're even getting their hands in South America. And so the CCP is basically, Spalding learned about this, by the way, by hearing a talk from somebody who was promoting this as a great business investment for Americans as well. What the CCP was doing was to develop new manufacturing within Africa, to develop roads and so forth for transportation of goods, and was also developing smarter smartphones. And the whole idea here is that China was even wanting to have cheaper manufacturing. They were building goods that they themselves already produce. In other words, producing cheaper manufacturing options for their own purchase, which shows you where they're looking ahead to find other countries to produce some of their goods for them at an even cheaper cost. So this is also happening, again, in other countries throughout the world. And China wants to monitor people as it does this. And so he pointed out the fact that in Africa, cell phone technology was even created to create better selfies of people with dark skin. And he thought, oh no, why? For facial recognition software, once again. So there's lots of things involved in this book. I hope I've whet your appetite. Haven't spoiled it, because there's so much more to have here. And I would really encourage you, if you have an interest in this, do get the book, audiobook, listen to it, read it, what have you. I think you'll be glad you did. All right. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.